Broader impacts was viewed as much more problematic. The good part is the intent of it is good, and it ought to be that there's a connection between scientific research and its impact on the rest of society, and I'll come back to that point again later. On the other hand, virtually everybody said the guidance is unclear, both in terms of what it is you needed to propose, and secondly, how it was going to be evaluated and how it was going to be weighed anyway. So some other stuff that we observed was that intellectual merit was typically given more weight than broader impacts during review, but that it wasn't consistent across different disciplines or across different parts of the NSF. The methods for assessing intellectual merit were pretty adequate. I don't know why that doesn't say publishing in Science and no other journals, but it, never mind. But the fact is that the assessment of broader impacts and the broader impacts criterion is very difficult. And that last point, I think, is a very important one, that many people believe that the institutions needed to be doing more to support the PI's efforts relating to broader impacts, and I would argue that's probably still true today. So our recommendations are pretty general. The two criteria do a good job capturing the major elements that should guide the evaluation of NSF proposals. There was a great need to clarify the description of the broader impacts criterion and how it's implemented, and there ought to be a set of core principles that overlay both criteria. Principles: all projects should be of the highest quality and have the potential to advance, if not transform, the frontiers. That was to make people who argued that everything was transformative happy. And then in the aggregate, and I added the term in the aggregate so I can explain that to you in more detail if you misbehave, but the idea was not to ask necessarily that every single project have a very clear, broader impact, but rather to make sure that in the aggregate, the work would in fact accomplish broader goals. And that, I think, is difficult to evaluate at times, but is an important point. Again, that the activities should be either related to specific projects or through other activities that are complementary to the project. And we can come back to that too. This is an important issue about how to do assessment because it's very difficult to assess every individual project, particularly in terms of broader impacts. Many projects are very important projects, but the magnitude of their effect won't be seen for a very long time, including on the rest of the world. And we made the argument, and I'll come back to this again, that the effectiveness of broader impact activities may best be done at a higher, more aggregated level, and that includes at the institutional level. So these are the two criteria. They're the same ones that there were before, basically. And then both criteria should have these elements considered. What's the potential to advance knowledge and benefit society? To what extent do the activities suggest and explore creative, original, or potentially transformative concepts? Is the plan good? And this should be true whichever criterion one is looking at. You know, is the plan good? How qualified is the individual? And are there adequate resources available to the PI to get it done? We then argued NSF should come up with a detailed implementation plan, should be clear and consistent, and I think both Dr. Cordova and I would be interested to know whether you think the way in which NSF has responded is in fact clear enough. because obviously you are the experts. And my question to you, therefore, I made that on their slide, so I probably screwed it up somehow. How's it done in clarifying it? And I really am not qualified to answer that question. I want to emphasize 2 points for broader impacts. First of all, the impact and evaluation could be viewed at the institutional level. That is to say, it ought to be possible, or it ought to be entertainable, if that was English, for an array of projects to be synergistic with each other, and then you evaluate the aggregate of them, rather than forcing every single project to have a measurable impact in the broader sense. And the second is that we very carefully left the targets for broader impacts more ambiguous than at least people believed the targets to be in the past. And I'll take a minute and focus on that. This is the point about assessment, and we were very specific about it, just repeating it. And let me try to go a bit broader. So, as we were working on the project, as I mentioned, the 2010 America Competes Act was in play, and it declared there shall be a broader impacts criterion. And it actually put it in stone and took out of the discussion whether or not there ought to be one. Many in the scientific community, as you may be aware, you must be aware, quietly prayed every night that the broader impacts criterion would dissolve. And that Reauthorization Act specified a list of impacts that would count. And they were clearly articulated, and I'll show you in 1 minute the list that our task force came up with, and they were intentionally different because we didn't feel that the Congress should be dictating in such a high level of detail what the outcomes should be of NSF-funded research, because then we feared that the investigators would feel constrained by that. And so we went to great efforts to make the point that the list of exemplars were to be examples. They weren't meant to be delimited. There's, of course, obvious overlap, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but the point was to have clear examples of the kinds of things, but we must have said it 4 times, that it was just a list of examples, and hopefully your colleagues and PIs are not, over faithfully trying to go through and match them. We now have on the table the new FIRST Act that is probably consuming a large part of Dr. Cordova's waking hours now that she has inherited it. And it's had some controversy around it because, among other things, it requires a formal determination by the responsible foundation official as to why, A, the project ought to be funded, and second, how it's in the national interest, and specifies the national interest. It's interesting that that is being proposed to be an overlay after normal peer review, which is sort of a big change in the way in which NSF does business. I will, however, point out and emphasize that, I don't see a laser pointer, but I'm sure there is one, but I just don't know how to work it there. That last possibility, promotion of the progress of science, adds a tremendous amount of leeway. And I think the intent of this act, really, this portion of the act, is to ask the question, why are you funding it? Be very clear about why you're funding it. And one of the reasons can be promoting the progress of science. Okay, so let me give you, I made that. Do you like that? Here, I'll show you again. So I thought I would take the last bit of time and just reflect some of my own thoughts about it. Am I talking too long? Am I all right? You okay?
No.
You're not bored yet?
I am okay.
Okay.
I'm not talking too long.
All right. Okay. My first observation is simple. Broader impacts is here to stay. The exact format and accounting or accountability will vary over time, but the public will always want assurance that their money is being well spent, and that's defined as spent well in their interest, not our interest. I do, however, believe that the responsibility for broader impacts is a responsibility for the host institution as well as for the individual. And that is something that is not well reflected in many of the institutions that many of us know well. Of course, not yours, they have you. And, do you like that? The degree of tie to explicit goals has varied and will always vary. You did not enjoy that enough. When I was in the government, I had like 5 people whose sole function was my life, and therefore they made all my slides. I make all my own slides now. Thank you. So I expect appreciation for anything that's sort of nifty. But anyway, this issue of the tie to goals has always been in place. In fact, a funny story, in the early 80s, I was asked to give a talk, actually at a AAAS meeting, on sort of the tension between centrally planned research, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. And I was, saying, oh, things have changed, now there's much more pressure to have science tied to national needs, and in the good old days, you could just let 1,000 flowers bloom and do whatever you want. An elderly gentleman in the front row raised his hand and said, Sonny, I was the science advisor to President X, and let me tell you, there were no good old days. They always wanted us to account for why should you pay for it. And the truth is, we do owe it to the public to explain what they're doing, but the pressure on how tied it has to be, or how tied your explanation, how clear your explanation has to be, has varied over time. And my point of view is, it's not inappropriate. There's nothing wrong with the public asking the question, what am I getting for this? Why would you want to do this? And at the risk of insulting somebody, there's an old saying that well, I think my next slide says this, yeah. Some scientists do what they do because it's interesting and provocative, but society only supports science because it advances the state of humankind. If we only supported science because it was interesting and provocative, the NSF budget would look more like the National Endowment for the Arts, or the National Endowment, that's the insult. But you get the point, that because there is a clear tie to the advancement of humankind, the public is willing to support science, not just because it's cute. And the fact that an individual scientist may do what he or she does for that reason is nice, but that's not from a societal point of view. This is my favorite quote in the world. Public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And I think that's the message that we all need to carry with us, including our colleagues in the scientific community. Okay, I just said that. Now, the question is, what's a reasonable answer? And I tried to think up what I could think up of what appropriate answers would be, tied to advancing a particular need. You can read as well as I, building the infrastructure of science. If it's a critical scientific issue, it ought to be that this is part of a progression of scientific studies, not a standalone study. Who can defend some of the standalone studies that all of us do, unless they're part of a discipline, a long-standing, and then serving some other? This is the one I hate. It cannot be, trust me, basic research has been good for you, and it will be good for you in the future. That doesn't sell, and as a taxpayer, I actually wouldn't buy it. because there are some things that may not be so good and so useful. Sorry. Okay, I think a lot of the issue, though, really has to do with broader public understanding, and it's why was so pleased to hear Dr. Cordova, because I think our thoughts about this appear to resonate. That is, a lot of the issue lies in a broader public understanding, and I think that requires an adjustment in how scientists engage with the public, including when they're doing broader impact activities. I'm not trying to argue that the utility has to be patently obvious. It doesn't. Innovative ideas are supposed to be odd. They're novel by definition. That's what innovation means. You didn't think of it before. But the reason we're supporting it should be understandable. And I think in order to do that, we have to shift how we approach the public and policymakers. So our attitude in the scientific community is that all we need is more public education or communication about science, and that's actually true, of course. That's a truism. But I think we have to get more nuanced. In many cases, the right approach is just traditional public communication or education. You know, if you just want to share the excitement or make some, fulfill some requirement or get more public support, share the excitement does work. But often the topics that we're studying are more complex and they're more controversial when they're met by the public. So I'm a neuroscientist. I worked for many years both in mental health and in drug abuse and addiction, although I did give up drugs. And when you're working in issues like that, simple public education in the traditional sense is not enough, because a lot of what science is showing conflicts with people's either core values, their beliefs, their peer group beliefs. I've just been through a lot of stuff around climate, and you know, we sort of bang our heads on the table and say it over and over, you know, human-induced climate change is true and it's going to hurt you, and people go, not true. That tension comes about in large part because what we're saying conflicts with what their peers believe, or it conflicts with what their colleagues believe. Anyway, and you need a different approach. The approach we advocate, I like this point, I'm going to say it, even though I was about to go past it. The core issue that I'm trying to make is that education by itself isn't going to do it, because it's not just lack of understanding. Often it's the case, embryonic stem cell research is my favorite example, where people do get it. That is, when surveys are done and people are asked, do you believe embryonic stem cell research will lead to new therapeutics and diagnostics? Overwhelmingly, yes. Do you want us to do embryonic stem cell research? Overwhelmingly, half say no. Why is that? It has to do with a conflict between their view of when life begins, and it's much more complicated. So the point is, they get it, they understand it, they don't like it, and they're not stuck with it. Only we're stuck with it. And that means that we need a different strategy. Just explaining, just we'll tell them again, doesn't work. And the different approach is called public engagement. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's a shift from communicating at the public to communicating with the public. And my view is that the scientific community has to do a much better job of listening to the public about their concerns, their priorities, and questions they'd like us to answer. This will have inflamed somebody. And we need to find common ground where we can, but we have to persist until we find it. Now, the problem is that it's not easy. First of all, many scientists, as you know better than I, are not equipped to speak about their work with the public and should not be allowed out in public. sorry. Just a quick story. So I've worked around public understanding of science for 30-some years. And when I first came to AAAS, I was invited to be on a panel on public understanding, and the person speaking before me was the newly elected president of an unnamed scientific society beginning with the initials FASEB, and he said his presidency would be devoted to every member speaking to their neighbors about their work. And I wasn't aware the microphone was on, and I whispered, God forbid. And it's actually a learned skill. We at AAAS have a whole program in how to communicate science, and I won't spend time on it, but there's a dedicated website, and we go out to universities with a flying squad, and we train scientists how to communicate with the public. The National Academy of Sciences has now had 2 Sackler Symposia dedicated to the topic. It's a learned skill. It's not a natural art. And what it is we're talking about is complicated. I won't go through that. These are just a couple of the principles of it, and then I'll stop. So the first thing is that scientists, these are just examples of what scientists need to learn that you could help them with. So the first is that communicating to the public and to scientists is exactly the opposite. Scientists like to tell a story. You know, we begin with, once upon a time there was a theory, and from the theory a hypothesis was devised. And then we go through all this detail, and by the 27th page, you get to the point of what you found. The public wants the bottom line. Then you can go back and tell them all the other stuff. But if you haven't captured their attention, you're dead. This one was a lesson I learned very hard. The gist of the message is all that matters. You don't get any clauses or caveats. I'm actually one of the people who brought you schizophrenia as a brain disease. I also brought you addiction as a brain disease. I'm sort of Johnny One Note. But my scientific colleagues didn't like that. So I always said, addiction is a brain disease, comma, expressed in behavioral ways and in a social context. Nobody ever heard anything but addiction is a brain disease. Got a lot of mileage out of it. But nonetheless, no caveats, no clauses. This one always inflames scientists. Scientists, unfortunately, are people. But if you're going to be communicating as a scientist, stick to the facts, leave your values out of it, even though policies are made on the basis of facts and values. As a scientist, you are not entitled to express your values. That will have inflamed somebody. Don't harangue the public. This one I really like. Credibility is conferred by the audience, not the speaker. I got that at the Sackler Symposium. I don't remember who said it. This is the only word you will leave here with, from what I've said. So glocal means that people only care about things that are personally or locally meaningful. Therefore, the first task is to make whatever it is you're talking about personally meaningful to the individual, right? Global, local, get it? This one I just love to put on. If you're really working on something, engagement works better. So like that. The big town hall meetings we all like to have. When I was the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I held 14 town meetings around the country. Typically, they consisted of a bunch of scientists giving little talks, and then the extreme points of view would grab each of the 2 microphones and they'd yell at each other for the remainder of it. It is not a good technique for public engagement. And of course, communication has to work both ways. My view is if we are going to make, I didn't make this, if we're going to make any progress at all as a scientific community in the coming era, we have got to align where we are, the public is, and policymakers. And that's what I advocate. Thank you.